The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Ravenscroft Palace as Lady Margaret stepped out of her private quarters. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the ancient walls seemed to whisper secrets that had been kept for generations. She pulled her silk shawl tighter around her shoulders, her mind heavy with thoughts that had plagued her sleep for weeks. Margaret had been the Queen's closest confidant for over 2 decades, serving first as a lady-in-waiting and, later, as the Queen's personal advisor. Her loyalty to the crown was unquestioned, but recent events had tested that loyalty in ways she never imagined possible. The weight of the secret she carried felt like a stone in her chest, growing heavier with each passing day. As she walked through the ornate hallways lined with portraits of long-dead monarchs, Margaret's thoughts drifted to that fateful night 3 months ago when everything changed. She had been returning late from a charity gala when she witnessed something that would alter the course of her life forever. In the dimly lit parking garage beneath the palace, she had seen Queen Isabella's trusted driver, Thomas, carefully loading what appeared to be a large, wrapped bundle into the trunk of an unmarked sedan. What made the scene particularly disturbing was not just the secretive nature of the activity, but the presence of Dr. Helena Marsh, the Queen's personal physician, who stood nearby with tears streaming down her face. The doctor's usually composed demeanor had cracked completely, and she was wringing her hands in obvious distress. Margaret had hidden behind a concrete pillar, her heart pounding as she watched the strange tableau unfold before her eyes. The bundle in Thomas's arms had moved slightly, and Margaret's blood had run cold when she realized what she was witnessing. The shape, the size, the way Thomas handled it with such careful tenderness. It could only be one thing. A child. But whose child? And why was it being secreted away from the palace in the dead of night? Now, months later, Margaret found herself at the center of a web of palace intrigue that threatened to tear apart everything she held dear. The Queen had been acting strangely ever since that night, often disappearing for hours at a time with no explanation. Crown Prince Alexander, the Queen's eldest son and heir to the throne, had become increasingly agitated and suspicious, questioning everyone's movements and demanding answers to questions that no one seemed willing or able to provide. But it was Prince Damien, the Queen's younger son, whose reaction had been the most troubling of all. When whispers of the mysterious midnight departure had begun circulating among the palace staff, Damien had flown into a rage unlike anything Margaret had ever witnessed. The usually composed and diplomatic prince had stormed through the palace halls, demanding to know where he was and threatening consequences that chilled Margaret to the bone. The morning following that confrontation, Margaret had noticed something that made her blood run cold. Prince Damien's wife, Princess Helena, had not been seen in public for over a week. When questioned about her absence, the palace had issued a brief statement claiming she was suffering from a minor illness and needed rest. But Margaret knew better. She had seen the haunted look in Elena's eyes during their last encounter, the way the young woman's hands had trembled as she spoke about protecting what was most precious to her. As Margaret made her way to the Queen's private study, she passed the portrait gallery where generations of royal children gazed down from their gilded frames. Each face told a story of privilege and duty, of lives lived in the public, yet shrouded in private mystery. She paused before a recent addition to the collection, a portrait of Princess Elena holding a baby, painted just over a year ago. The child in the painting had Elena's dark eyes, but bore an unmistakable resemblance to someone else entirely. The pieces of the puzzle had been slowly falling into place over the past weeks. Palace records that had mysteriously disappeared, staff members who had been quietly transferred to other positions, and, most telling of all, the sudden appearance of enhanced security measures around the east wing of the palace, the same wing where Elena and Damien's private apartments were located. Margaret knocked softly on the Queen's study door, her knuckles barely making a sound against the heavy oak. "Enter," came the familiar voice from within, though it lacked its usual authority and warmth. Queen Isabella sat behind her mahogany desk, her usually perfect posture slightly slumped, making her appear older than her 62 years. Dark circles under her eyes spoke of sleepless nights, and her normally immaculate appearance showed signs of strain. "Your Majesty," Margaret said, offering a slight curtsy before taking the seat across from the Queen. "You asked to see me?" Isabella looked up from the document she had been pretending to read, her blue eyes searching Margaret's face with an intensity that made the older woman uncomfortable. Margaret, you've been with this family for many years. Your discretion and loyalty have never been in question. Of course, Your Majesty. You know you can trust me completely. The queen rose from her chair and walked to the large window that overlooked the palace gardens. In the distance, Margaret could see the groundskeepers tending to the rose bushes that had been Isabella's pride and joy since her coronation. There are times when loyalty to the crown and loyalty to the family come into conflict, Isabella said quietly, her breath fogging the glass slightly. Times when the right choice isn't clear, even to those who wear the crown. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. Was the queen about to confide in her about that night? About the child she had seen Thomas carry away? Your Majesty, if there's anything troubling you, anything at all, you know I'm here to help in whatever way I can. Isabella turned back toward her, and Margaret was struck by how vulnerable the monarch appeared in that moment. Gone was the regal bearing and commanding presence that had defined her reign. In its place was a woman grappling with an impossible situation, torn between duty and love, between the public good and private loyalty. Margaret, what would you do if you discovered that someone you loved, someone you had protected and cherished, had done something that could destroy everything you've worked to build? Something that could bring down not just them, but innocent people as well. The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Margaret felt the weight of all her suspicions pressing down upon her. She thought of Princess Elena's haunted expression, of Prince Damien's explosive anger, of the mysterious bundle she had seen Thomas carry away. Most of all, she thought of the child in Elena's portrait, the child who was nowhere to be seen in the palace anymore. Your Majesty, Margaret said carefully, choosing her words with the precision of someone walking through a minefield, I believe that sometimes the greatest act of love is making the hardest choice, even when it breaks our hearts to do so. Isabella's eyes filled with tears that she quickly blinked away. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I believe you're right. Before Margaret could respond, a sharp knock on the study door interrupted them. Without waiting for permission, Crown Prince Alexander burst into the room, his face flushed with anger and determination. Behind him stood Captain Morrison, the head of palace security, looking grim and uncomfortable. Mother, Alexander said, his voice tight with controlled fury, we need to talk. Now. Isabella straightened, the queen emerging from behind the vulnerable woman's facade like a mask being put back in place. Alexander, you will remember your manners in my presence. My manners? Alexander laughed bitterly. Mother, I think we've moved far beyond concerns about etiquette. Captain Morrison has some very interesting information to share about recent activities in the palace. Activities that I think you'll find quite illuminating. Captain Morrison stepped forward reluctantly, his weathered face showing the strain of whatever information he was about to reveal. Your Majesty, I'm afraid there's been a development in our ongoing security review. We've discovered some irregularities in the logs from 3 months ago, the night of the Pemberton Charity Gala. Margaret's heart began to race. This was it, the moment when all the carefully hidden secrets would be dragged into the light. Isabella's face remained perfectly composed, but Margaret noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she clasped them behind her back. What kind of irregularities, Captain? Vehicle movements that weren't properly logged, Your Majesty. Specifically, an unmarked sedan that left the palace grounds at approximately 2:30 a.m. The vehicle was driven by Thomas Reynolds, but there's no record of authorization for the trip, no destination logged, and no passengers listed. Alexander stepped closer to his mother, his eyes blazing with an emotion Margaret couldn't quite identify. But that's not the most interesting part, is it, Captain? Morrison shifted uncomfortably. No, Your Highness. We've also discovered that the vehicle's GPS tracking system was deliberately disabled for that journey. Someone with high-level access codes made sure there would be no electronic record of where that car went or what its purpose was. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner. Margaret could feel the tension crackling between mother and son like electricity before a storm. Queen Isabella's composure was beginning to crack, but she held her ground with the dignity that had seen her through 25 years on the throne. I see, Isabella said finally. And what conclusions are you drawing from these irregularities? Alexander's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. The same conclusions I've been drawing for months, Mother. Someone in this family has been hiding something. Something big enough to require midnight departures and disabled tracking systems. Something worth lying about to the heir to the throne. Margaret watched in fascination and horror as the royal family began to tear itself apart before her eyes. She thought of all the state dinners she had attended, all the public appearances where they had presented a united front to the world. The contrast between that public image and the raw emotion in this room was staggering. "Alexander," Isabella said, her voice carrying a warning tone that Margaret had heard her use with foreign dignitaries who overstepped their bounds. "You are making accusations without fully understanding the situation." "Then, help me understand." Alexander exploded, his royal composure finally cracking completely. "Help me understand why my brother has been acting like a man possessed for months. Help me understand why Elena hasn't been seen in public for weeks. Help me understand why palace staff are being transferred without explanation and why security protocols are being changed without consulting me." He paused, breathing heavily, before delivering what Margaret realized was the real blow. "Most of all, Mother, help me understand where Elena's son is. Because that's what this is really about, isn't it? The child who was born here in this palace, but who seems to have vanished into thin air." The words hit the room like a physical force. Isabella actually staggered backward, gripping the edge of her desk for support. Margaret felt as though the floor had dropped out from beneath her feet. So her suspicions had been correct. The bundle she had seen Thomas carry away had been Elena's child. But why? What could have possibly driven them to such desperate measures? Captain Morrison looked as though he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. His loyalty to the crown was absolute, but he was clearly caught between his duty to report security irregularities and his desire to stay out of royal family disputes. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "there is one more thing. We've received a request from an outside agency to investigate the palace's internal security measures. They're particularly interested in any unusual activities from the past 6 months." "What kind of agency?" Isabella asked, though Margaret could tell from her expression that she already suspected the answer. "Child Protective Services, Your Majesty. They've received an anonymous tip claiming that a child may have been removed from the palace under questionable circumstances." The revelation hung in the air like a death sentence. Margaret realized that whatever secret the royal family had been trying to protect was about to be exposed to the world. The implications were staggering, not just for the individuals involved, but for the monarchy itself. Alexander's face had gone pale, but his resolve seemed to strengthen rather than weaken in the face of this news. "Mother, I'm going to ask you one more time, and I need you to tell me the truth. Where is Elena's son? And why was he taken away in the middle of the night like some kind of criminal?" Queen Isabella looked at her eldest son for a long moment, her expression cycling through love, pain, and something that looked almost like relief. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but every word was clear and precise. "Because, my dear son, that child's true parentage would destroy this family and bring down the crown. Because sometimes the greatest sacrifice a grandmother can make is to protect her grandsons from a truth that would destroy them both." The admission hung in the air like smoke, choking everyone in the room with its implications. Margaret felt her world shifting beneath her feet as she began to understand the true scope of the secret that had been hidden within the palace walls. Alexander's face went through a series of emotions: confusion, realization, and, finally, a horror so profound that it seemed to age him 10 years in as many seconds. "You don't mean—" he began, but couldn't finish the sentence. Isabella nodded slowly, tears finally beginning to flow down her cheeks. "I mean exactly what you think I mean, Alexander. And God help us all, but it's only the beginning." The silence that followed Queen Isabella's admission stretched endlessly, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock that had witnessed generations of royal secrets. Captain Morrison stood frozen in place, his military bearing the only thing preventing him from collapsing under the weight of what he had just heard. Margaret felt as though she were watching history unfold before her eyes, the kind of history that would be written about in hushed whispers for decades to come. Prince Alexander's face had drained of all color, his usual commanding presence reduced to that of a man grappling with an unthinkable reality. "The child," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Elena's son. His father. It's not Damien, is it?" Isabella closed her eyes, as if blocking out the sight of her son's anguish could somehow lessen the pain of her revelation. "No," she said simply. "It's not Damien." The implications crashed over Alexander like a wave, and Margaret watched as understanding dawned in his eyes. The royal succession, the legitimacy of future heirs, the very foundation of their family's claim to the throne. Everything was now in question. But there was something else in Alexander's expression, something that made Margaret's heart race with a new kind of dread. "Mother," Alexander said, his voice gaining strength as anger began to replace shock. "Tell me it's not what I think it is. Tell me that child's father is someone outside this family. Please." Isabella opened her eyes and looked directly at her eldest son, her gaze unflinching despite the tears that continued to flow. "I cannot tell you that, Alexander. I cannot give you that comfort." The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. He stumbled backward, gripping the back of a chair for support, his face a mask of revulsion and betrayal. "How long have you known?" he asked, his voice hollow. "I suspected from the beginning," Isabella replied. The timing, the secrecy surrounding Elena's pregnancy, the way Damien insisted on having only Dr. Marsh attend to her, it all pointed to something being terribly wrong. But I didn't want to believe it. I told myself that my suspicions were unfounded, that surely my own sons wouldn't. She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence that would make the unthinkable fully real. Margaret felt sick to her stomach as the full picture began to emerge. The mysterious departure she had witnessed, the child being spirited away in the dead of night, Elena's recent absence from public life. It all made horrible sense now. The child that had been born into the royal family was the product of a forbidden relationship between Prince Damien and his own brother's wife. But even as that shocking truth settled into her consciousness, Margaret realized there had to be more to the story. The way Isabella had phrased her revelation, the mention of protecting her grandsons, plural, suggested that the web of deception was even more complex than she had initially understood. Captain Morrison finally found his voice, though it cracked with the strain of processing what he had heard. "Your Majesty, with respect, if what you're suggesting is true, then we're looking at a scandal that could bring down the monarchy. The press, the parliament, the people, they would never accept such a betrayal of trust." Isabella straightened, drawing on reserves of strength that Margaret had seen her summon during national crises and international incidents. "Do you think I don't know that, Captain? Do you think I haven't spent every waking moment of the past year trying to figure out how to protect this family and this institution from the consequences of my son's actions?" Alexander suddenly straightened, his face hardening with a new realization. "Elena," he said urgently. "Where is Elena? If the child has been taken away, what's happened to her? She must be destroyed by this." "Elena is safe," Isabella said quickly. "She's at the summer estate in Scotland, under the care of Dr. Marsh and a small, trusted staff. She's not handling the separation well, but she understands the necessity of it." "The necessity?" Alexander's voice rose with incredulous anger. "Mother, we're talking about a woman being separated from her child, a child she carried and gave birth to, regardless of the circumstances of his conception. How can you speak of necessity when we're dealing with such fundamental human bonds?" Margaret watched the exchange with growing horror, realizing that every decision that had been made in this impossible situation had only created new layers of tragedy. The child, innocent of any wrongdoing, had been torn from his mother. Elena, regardless of her role in creating this crisis, was suffering the loss of her son. And the royal family was tearing itself apart, trying to contain a secret that seemed destined to destroy them all. "Where's the child now?" Alexander asked, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that Margaret had never heard before. "Where exactly did Thomas take him that night?" Isabella hesitated, and Margaret could see the internal battle playing out across her features. Each revelation brought them deeper into dangerous territory, but the lies and half-truths were no longer sustainable. "He's with a family in Canada," Isabella said finally. "Good people, distant relatives who understand the situation and are willing to provide a loving home. The child will be cared for, educated, and raised with all the advantages we can provide, just not here and not under his true name." Alexander began pacing the room like a caged animal, his mind clearly working through the implications of every detail his mother had revealed. "And Damien? Does he know where his son is?" "Damien believes the child died during birth," Isabella said quietly. "It was Dr. Marsh who suggested it. She said it was the only way to prevent him from trying to claim the child or create an even bigger scandal. Elena agreed to the deception, and we let him believe it." The admission hit the room like a thunderbolt. Margaret gasped audibly, unable to contain her shock at the elaborate web of lies that had been constructed to manage this crisis. Captain Morrison's professional composure cracked completely, and he sank into a chair, his head in his hands. "Mother," Alexander said, his voice filled with a mixture of horror and disbelief, "you let Damien believe his child was dead? You watched him grieve for a son who was very much alive and being spirited away to another continent. What choice did I have?" Isabella shot back, her own composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of months of impossible decisions. "Tell him the truth? Let him demand access to a child whose very existence threatens the legitimacy of our family's reign? Alexander, that child's DNA would prove beyond any doubt that he's Damien's son, and Elena's medical records would show that she was pregnant during a time when she and your brother were having an affair." Alexander stopped pacing and stared at his mother with an expression that chilled Margaret to the bone. "Our family's reign," he repeated slowly. "Mother, whose family's reign are we talking about? Because if what you're saying is true, if Damien and Elena had an affair that produced a child, then the succession itself is in question." Isabella's face went ashen. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Alexander said with deadly calm, "that if Damien was willing to betray his marriage vows and carry on an affair with his brother's wife, what else might he be willing to do? What other lies might he have told? What other deceptions might he have orchestrated?" Margaret felt the blood drain from her face as she began to understand where Alexander's thoughts were leading. The succession to the throne was based on legitimacy and truth. If one fundamental truth had been corrupted, it called everything else into question. "Alexander, what are you suggesting?" Isabella asked, though Margaret could tell from her expression that she was beginning to grasp the full implications of her son's words. "I'm suggesting, Mother, that we need to know the complete truth about Damien's relationship with Elena. When did it start? How long did it continue? And, most importantly," Alexander paused, his next words coming out like a death sentence, "are there other children?" The question hung in the air like a physical presence, and Margaret realized that what she had thought was the complete revelation was actually just the tip of an iceberg that could sink the entire royal family. Isabella's legs seemed to give out, and she sank in her chair, her face a mask of devastation. "Oh God," she whispered. "Oh dear God, you don't think—" Elena's other pregnancies. Alexander's expression hardened. "Mother, Elena has had 3 children during her marriage to Damien. 3. Now we know that at least one of them isn't Damien's biological child. The question is, how many of the others share the same illegitimate parentage?" Margaret felt the room spinning around her. Princess Elena had indeed had 3 children during her 12-year marriage to Prince Damien. The eldest, Princess Sophia, was now 11 years old. The middle child, Prince Marcus, was 8. And the youngest, the boy who had been spirited away in Thomas's car, had been just over a year old when he disappeared. Captain Morrison looked up from his hands, his face grave with the implications of what they were discussing. "Your Majesty, if you're suggesting that the royal succession has been compromised by illegitimate heirs, then we're looking at a constitutional crisis of unprecedented proportions." Isabella nodded slowly, the full weight of the situation finally settling upon her shoulders. "Alexander, I need you to understand that everything I've done, every lie I've told, every secret I've kept, has been to protect this family and this institution. But if what you're suggesting is true, then we need to know everything," Alexander finished. "Every detail, every timeline, every possibility. Because if Damien's children are not legitimately his, then the entire line of succession changes." Margaret's mind raced as she considered the implications. Prince Alexander was currently heir to the throne, followed by his own children. But if Prince Damien's children were illegitimate, it would not only remove them from the succession, but could potentially call into question the validity of Damien's marriage itself. "There's something else," Isabella said quietly, her voice barely audible. "Something I haven't told you about that night. The night Thomas took the child away." Alexander turned toward his mother with an expression of exhausted dread. "What else, Mother? What other secrets have you been keeping?" "Elena wasn't alone when she gave birth," Isabella said. "Damien was there, in the room, holding her hand. And when Dr. Marsh told them that the child had died, Damien's reaction wasn't what we expected." Margaret leaned forward, despite herself, drawn into the terrible tale that continued to unfold. "What do you mean?" Alexander asked. "He didn't grieve the way a father should," Isabella continued. "He didn't demand to see the body. didn't ask questions about what went wrong. Instead, he seemed relieved, almost grateful, as if the child's supposed death had solved a problem for him rather than created a tragedy. The admission hung in the air like a noxious cloud. Margaret felt sick as she realized what Isabella was implying, that Damien had known all along that the child wasn't his, and that the supposed death had freed him from having to deal with the consequences of his wife's affair. But with whom? That was the question that Margaret could see burning in Alexander's eyes. If Damien knew the child wasn't his, then he knew who the real father was. And his reaction suggested that the truth was even more damaging than they had initially understood. "Mother," Alexander said slowly, "who is the father of Elena's child?" Isabella looked at her eldest son for a long moment, and Margaret could see the internal war playing out across her features. This was the moment of ultimate truth, the revelation that would either destroy them all or provide a path towards some kind of resolution. "Alexander," she said finally, her voice breaking with emotion, "I think you already know the answer to that question." The words hit Alexander like a physical blow, and he staggered backward, his face cycling through disbelief, horror, and, finally, a terrible understanding. Margaret watched as the pieces fell into place in his mind, as he arrived at the conclusion that would change everything. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No, that's not possible. It can't be." But, even as he denied it, Margaret could see in his eyes that he believed it was not only possible, but probable. And, as the truth settled into her own consciousness, she realized that the royal family's problems were far worse than anyone could have imagined. Because if her growing suspicion was correct, the child that had been taken away that night wasn't just the product of an illicit affair. It was the product of an affair that struck at the very heart of the royal succession itself. The truth that Alexander refused to voice hung in the air between them, like a sword suspended by a thread. Margaret watched as the crown prince struggled with a realization so devastating that his mind seemed to reject it even as the evidence mounted. Queen Isabella sat in her chair like a woman awaiting execution, her royal composure finally stripped away to reveal the broken mother beneath. Captain Morrison, sensing that he was witnessing something beyond his pay grade, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Your Majesty, perhaps I should withdraw and allow you to discuss this matter privately with Prince Alexander." "No," Alexander said sharply, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Captain Morrison stays, because if what I think is true, we're going to need his help to manage what comes next." Isabella nodded slowly, resignation etched in every line of her face. "Alexander, I know what you're thinking, and I know how impossible it seems. But sometimes the unthinkable becomes reality, and we have to find a way to live with consequences we never imagined." Margaret felt her heart racing as she waited for someone to say aloud what they were all thinking. The implications were so staggering, so fundamentally destructive to everything the royal family represented, that even acknowledging the possibility felt like an act of treason. "Mother," Alexander said finally, his voice hollow with the weight of understanding, "the child's father. It's me, isn't it?" The words fell into the room like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock and horror in all directions. Margaret gripped the arms of her chair, feeling dizzy as the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Captain Morrison went pale, his military training the only thing keeping him upright as he processed the magnitude of what he had just heard. Isabella closed her eyes and nodded, a single tear escaping to trace down her cheek. "Yes," she whispered. "Elena's youngest son is your child, Alexander. Your son." The admission shattered something fundamental in the room. Margaret realized she was holding her breath, afraid that even the sound of breathing might somehow make this terrible truth more real. The crown prince of the realm, heir to the throne, had fathered a child with his brother's wife. The implications for the succession, for the monarchy itself, were beyond catastrophic. Alexander began laughing, a sound so bitter and broken that it made Margaret's skin crawl. "My son," he repeated, the words seeming to taste like poison in his mouth. "My son, who the world believes is my brother's child. My son, who has been hidden away like a dirty secret because his very existence would destroy everything our family has built." "Alexander," Isabella said, rising from her chair and reaching toward him, "please understand that we had no choice. When Elena came to me and told me the truth about the pregnancy, when she revealed that you were the father, we had to find a way to protect everyone involved. Protect everyone. Alexander's voice rose to nearly a shout. Mother, we're talking about my child. My son. And you made the decision to let me believe he was dead, to let me grieve for him, while secretly sending him away to live with strangers on another continent. Margaret watched the confrontation with growing horror, realizing that every decision made in this impossible situation had created new victims and new layers of tragedy. The child, innocent of any wrongdoing, had been separated from both his biological parents. Elena had been forced to give up her son and live with the knowledge that her affair had created a crisis that threatened the monarchy. Alexander had unknowingly grieved for a son who was alive but forever lost to him. How long? Alexander demanded, his voice cracking with emotion. How long had Elena and how long was our affair? Isabella's expression grew even more pained, if such a thing were possible. 3 years, she said quietly. From what Elena told me, it began during the state visit to Australia and continued until she became pregnant. Margaret felt the room spinning as she processed this information. 3 years of deception, 3 years of secret meetings and lies. And during that time, Elena had also been intimate with her husband, creating the perfect cover for her affair with his brother. Captain Morrison finally found his voice, though it came out strained and uncertain. Your Majesty, Your Highness, I need to ask, does Prince Damien know? Does he suspect that his wife had an affair with his brother? Alexander and Isabella exchanged a look that spoke volumes. Margaret could see the answer in their expressions before either of them spoke. We don't know for certain, Isabella said carefully, but his reaction to the child's supposed death, his behavior over the past months, we suspect he may know more than he's admitted. Alexander suddenly straightened, a new horror dawning in his eyes. The other children, he said urgently. Sophia and Marcus. Are they? We don't know, Isabella said quickly. Elena insisted that they were Damien's biological children, conceived during periods when you and she weren't involved. But without genetic testing that would expose everything, Alexander finished grimly. Even if we could somehow arrange for secret tests, the very act of ordering them would create questions we can't answer. Margaret realized that the royal family was trapped in an impossible situation. They couldn't verify the paternity of the children without risking exposure of the affair. They couldn't acknowledge the truth about the youngest child without destroying the monarchy. And they couldn't continue the deception without living with the constant threat of discovery. There's something else, Isabella said hesitantly. Something that makes the situation even more complicated. Alexander stared at his mother with an expression of exhausted dread. What else, Mother? What other bombshell do you have to drop? Elena wants her son back, Isabella said quietly. She's been calling me daily from Scotland, begging me to arrange for her to see him. She says she can't live with the separation anymore, that she's willing to confess everything publicly if it means being reunited with him. The revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt. Margaret gasped audibly, realizing that all their careful planning and secret arrangements could be undone by a mother's desperate love for her child. She would destroy us all, Alexander said, his voice flat with disbelief. Elena would bring down the monarchy, destroy Damien's life, ruin her other children's futures, all to be with a child she can never publicly acknowledge as hers. She's in agony, Isabella replied. Dr. Marsh says she's barely eating, barely sleeping. The guilt and grief are consuming her. She blames herself for the affair, for getting pregnant, for agreeing to give up the child. She's talking about suicide, Alexander. We may lose her entirely if we don't find a way to resolve this. Captain Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Your Majesty, if Princess Elena is threatening to go public with this information, then we need to consider our options very carefully. Once this story breaks, and it will break if she follows through on her threats, there will be no controlling the narrative. Alexander began pacing again, his mind clearly racing through possibilities and consequences. The press would have a feeding frenzy, he muttered. The opposition party would call for investigations. Parliament might vote to abolish the monarchy entirely. And the Commonwealth nations. God only knows how they would react to this kind of scandal. Margaret watched the crown prince as he grappled with the magnitude of the crisis. And she found herself thinking about the child at the center of it all. Somewhere in Canada, a little boy was growing up with no knowledge of his true identity, unaware that he was the son of the future king of England and the cause of a scandal that threatened to bring down a 1,000-year-old institution. "There's one more thing," Isabella said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something I haven't told anyone, not even Dr. Marsh." Alexander stopped pacing and stared at his mother with an expression of pure dread. "What now, mother? What other secret have you been keeping?" "Elena isn't the only one who wants the child back," Isabella said. "You have been asking about him too, Alexander. In your sleep." The admission hung in the air like a death sentence. Margaret realized that even Alexander's subconscious was betraying him, that the grief and guilt over his lost son was eating away at him despite his conscious efforts to suppress it. "What do you mean?" Alexander asked, though Margaret could tell from his expression that he already knew. "You've been talking in your sleep," Isabella explained. "About a little boy with dark eyes who calls you Papa. About trips to Canada to visit someone special. Your wife has been concerned about it for weeks, but she assumed you were just having stressed dreams about the pressures of succession." Alexander's face crumpled with emotion. "My son," he whispered. "My son is out there somewhere, and I can't even acknowledge his existence. I can't hold him, can't watch him grow up, can't be a father to him in any meaningful way." Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes as she witnessed the raw pain of a father separated from his child by circumstances beyond anyone's control. The tragedy of the situation was almost unbearable. A father, mother, and child all suffering because of choices made in desperation and fear. "Alexander," Isabella said gently, "there may be a way to resolve this. A way to bring the child back without exposing the truth." Both Alexander and Captain Morrison turned toward the Queen with expressions of desperate hope mixed with skepticism. "What kind of way?" Alexander asked. Isabella took a deep breath before answering. "Damien has been asking questions about Elena's absence. He's suspicious about her extended stay in Scotland, and he's been pressuring me for answers. What if we told him part of the truth?" "What part?" Alexander demanded. "What if we told him that Elena had an affair, that the youngest child isn't his, but we let him believe the father was someone outside the family? A foreign diplomat, perhaps, or someone from Elena's past. We could arrange for the child to be found, claim that he didn't actually die, but was kidnapped and has now been recovered." Margaret felt her breath catch as she considered the implications of this plan. It would allow Elena to be reunited with her son and would give Alexander access to his child. But it would require Damien to accept that his wife had betrayed him and that the child he had believed was his son was actually another man's. "You want to destroy Damien's marriage to save Elena's sanity and give me access to my son," Alexander said slowly. "I want to find a solution that minimizes the damage to everyone involved," Isabella corrected. "Damien's marriage is already over and all, but Elena will never be able to return to him after what's happened. At least this way, he gets to keep his dignity and his place in the succession." Captain Morrison cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, with respect, this plan has some significant problems. First, it requires us to fabricate evidence of a kidnapping, which would involve lying to law enforcement agencies. Second, it assumes Prince Damien will accept this explanation without demanding details about Elena's supposed affair partner. And third, it still leaves us vulnerable to exposure if anyone decides to conduct genetic testing." Alexander nodded grimly. "The captain's right, Mother. This plan is built on lies that could collapse at any moment. And it still doesn't address the fundamental problem. My son will never know who his real father is. Unless," Isabella said quietly, "we find a way to tell him the truth when he's older, when he's mature enough to understand the complexities of the situation and make his own choices about how to handle the knowledge." Margaret realized that they were discussing creating an even more elaborate web of deception, one that would require the cooperation of dozens of people and would remain vulnerable to exposure for decades to come. The risks were enormous, but so was the potential for healing some of the damage that had already been done. "There's one person we haven't considered in all of this," Alexander said suddenly. "Elena's other children, Sophia and Marcus. How do we explain to them why their baby brother suddenly reappeared after being dead for months? How do we justify separating them from their mother for weeks without explanation?" The question highlighted yet another tragic dimension of the crisis. Elena's older children had been living with the belief that their baby brother had died, and now their mother had essentially abandoned them to grieve alone in Scotland. The psychological damage to those innocent children was incalculable. We tell them that new evidence emerged suggesting the baby had been kidnapped, Isabella said. We create a story about ransom demands and secret negotiations. It's not perfect, but it's believable enough to satisfy children their age. More lies, Alexander said bitterly. More deception piled on top of deception. Mother, don't you see what we're doing? We're creating a house of cards that will collapse eventually, and when it does, the damage will be even worse than if we had just told the truth from the beginning. Isabella's expression hardened with determination. Alexander, the truth would destroy us all. It would end the monarchy, ruin multiple lives, and traumatize innocent children. Sometimes the greater good requires us to make choices that feel wrong, but are ultimately necessary. Margaret watched this exchange with growing unease, realizing that the royal family was about to embark on an even more dangerous path of deception. But she could also see the impossible position they were in. There truly seemed to be no choice that didn't result in devastating consequences for someone. The question that remained was whether they could pull off such an elaborate deception, and more importantly, whether they could live with themselves if they succeeded. 7. The weight of decision hung heavy in Queen Isabella's study as the afternoon light began to fade through the tall windows. Margaret observed the tableau before her with a mixture of fascination and dread. A royal family on the brink of implementing a deception so elaborate it would require the cooperation of dozens of people across multiple countries. The risks were staggering, but the alternative seemed to promise certain destruction for everyone involved. Alexander had been silent for nearly 10 minutes, staring out at the palace gardens where his own children often played, blissfully unaware of the crisis that threatened to tear their world apart. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with resignation and resolve. "If we're going to do this," he said slowly, "if we're going to attempt to bring my son back through this elaborate fiction, then we need to plan every detail perfectly. One mistake, one inconsistency, and everything falls apart." Isabella nodded, relief evident in her expression despite the magnitude of what they were contemplating. "Captain Morrison, we'll need your complete cooperation and discretion. The security implications of this operation are enormous." Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His loyalty to the crown was absolute, but Margaret could see the internal struggle playing out across his weathered features. "Your Majesty, what you're asking me to do, it involves fabricating evidence of a crime, lying to law enforcement agencies in multiple countries, and creating false documentation. If this plan fails, if we're exposed, I could face criminal charges." "If this plan fails," Alexander said grimly, "criminal charges will be the least of our worries. Captain, I need you to understand something. This isn't just about protecting the monarchy or even protecting my family. There's a little boy out there who has already been traumatized by being separated from his mother. If we don't find a way to resolve this situation, that child could be permanently damaged by the chaos we've created." Margaret watched as Morrison wrestled with the implications of what they were asking him to do. She could see the moment when his duty as a protector of children overcame his concerns about legal ramifications. "What exactly would you need me to do?" Morrison asked finally. Isabella leaned forward, her expression intense with concentration. "First, we need to create a believable backstory for the supposed kidnapping. The timeline needs to be perfect, and the details need to be specific enough to satisfy investigators, but not so specific that they can be easily disproven. We'll need to coordinate with the Canadian authorities where the child is currently staying," Alexander added. "They'll need to understand their role in this fiction without being told the complete truth about why it's necessary." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the scope of international cooperation this plan would require. "Your Majesty," she said hesitantly, "what about the family caring for the child in Canada? They know the truth about his parentage. How can we trust them to maintain the deception?" Isabella's expression grew pained. They're distant relatives who have been compensated generously for their silence. They believe they're protecting the child from a scandal that would destroy his life. But you're right, they represent a potential vulnerability in our plan. "More than potential," Alexander said darkly. "They represent a ticking time bomb. Every day that passes increases the risk that someone will talk, that someone will ask the wrong questions, or that someone will simply refuse to continue living with such an enormous lie." Captain Morrison pulled out a notebook and began writing. "Let's focus on what we can control," he said with military precision. "The timeline for the supposed kidnapping. We'll need to establish when it allegedly took place, who was supposedly responsible, and how the recovery was achieved. The kidnapping would have had to occur shortly after the birth, Isabella said, during the confusion surrounding the medical emergency that we claimed took the child's life. We can say that hospital security was compromised and that the kidnappers took advantage of the chaos. Alexander nodded slowly. And the recovery? How do we explain suddenly finding him after months of supposed searching? Anonymous tip, Morrison suggested. Someone with inside knowledge of the kidnapping operation who developed a conscience and provided information to authorities. It's vague enough to be believable, but specific enough to justify the recovery. Margaret listened to this planning session with growing unease. The ease with which these intelligent, moral people were constructing an elaborate fiction disturbed her more than she cared to admit. But she also understood the desperation that drove them. They were trying to salvage something positive from a situation that offered nothing but tragic choices. There's still the problem of Prince Damien, she said quietly. Even if he accepts the story about Elena having an affair with an outsider, he's going to want details. He's going to want to know who the man was, how the affair developed, why Elena never told him. The more questions he asks, the more likely we are to contradict ourselves. Isabella's expression grew thoughtful. Perhaps it's time to bring Damien into the conversation. Not the complete truth, but enough of it to make him an ally rather than an obstacle. Alexander turned away from the window, his face incredulous. You want to tell Damien that his wife had an affair and that his youngest son isn't biologically his? Mother, that conversation could go disastrously wrong. It's going to go disastrously wrong eventually anyway, Isabella replied. Damien isn't stupid, Alexander. He's already suspicious about Elena's absence, about the secrecy surrounding the child's supposed death, about the changes in palace security protocols. If we don't control the narrative, he's going to create his own version of events. Margaret could see the wisdom in Isabella's reasoning, but she also understood Alexander's concerns. Prince Damien's reaction to learning about his wife's affair could range from grief to rage to demands for revenge. Any of those responses could jeopardize their carefully constructed plan. What if his reaction is to expose everything publicly? Alexander asked. What if he decides that if his life is being destroyed by this scandal, he might as well take all of us down with him? Then we need to give him a reason to protect the secret, Isabella said firmly. We need to make him understand that exposing the truth wouldn't just destroy us. It would destroy his other children as well. The mention of Sophia and Marcus brought a new dimension to the conversation that Margaret found particularly heartbreaking. Those children had already lost their baby brother to a supposed death, then lost their mother to her mysterious illness in Scotland. Now they were potentially going to lose their father to the revelation that their family was built on lies and deception. Speaking of the other children, Alexander said, we need to consider how this supposed recovery of their baby brother is going to affect them psychologically. They've been grieving his death for months. Suddenly, learning that he's alive but was kidnapped is going to be traumatic in a completely different way. Captain Morrison looked up from his notes. We'll need to coordinate with child psychologists, he said, both for the children here who will be told about the recovery, and for the child in Canada who will need to be prepared for a dramatic change in his living situation. Assuming Elena agrees to return here with him, Isabella said, we haven't actually discussed whether she's willing to come back and resume her life in the palace, knowing that her husband now knows about her affair. Margaret felt a chill of realization. Your Majesty, what if Elena refuses to return? What if she decides that she'd rather stay in Canada with her son, even if it means never seeing her other children again? The question hung in the air like a sword over their heads. They were assuming Elena's cooperation in a plan that would require her to face her husband after months of deception, to lie about the identity of her child's father, and to live every day knowing that one wrong word could bring down the monarchy. Elena will come back, Isabella said with more confidence than Margaret thought the situation warranted. She won't abandon Sophia and Marcus. Whatever else has happened, whatever mistake she's made, she's still their mother. Alexander wasn't convinced. Mother, Elena is in an impossible position. She's been separated from one child for months, which has nearly driven her to suicide. Now we're asking her to return to live with the man she betrayed, to maintain a fiction about her son's parentage, and to trust that no one will ever reveal the truth. That's an enormous psychological burden to place on someone who's already fragile, which is why we need to move quickly, Isabella replied. The longer Elena remains separated from her son, the more unstable she becomes. And the longer we delay implementing this plan, the more likely it is that someone else will uncover the truth and force our hand. Margaret realized that time was indeed working against them. Child Protective Services had already received an anonymous tip about a child being removed from the palace under suspicious circumstances. It would only be a matter of time before their investigation intensified and began to uncover inconsistencies in the official story. "Your Majesty," Morrison said, "I need to ask about the anonymous tip to Child Protective Services. Do we know who made that call?" Isabella and Alexander exchanged a look that spoke volumes. Margaret could see that this was yet another complication they had been hoping to avoid discussing. "We suspect it was Dr. Marsh," Isabella said reluctantly. "She's been struggling with her conscience about her role in the deception. She's the one who falsified the death certificate, who helped coordinate the child's removal from the palace, who's been providing medical care to Elena in Scotland. The guilt has been eating away at her. And if Dr. Marsh decides to tell the truth to the authorities?" Alexander asked. "If she decides that her medical ethics require her to expose what we've done, then we're finished," Isabella said simply. "Dr. Marsh knows everything about the affair, about the child's true parentage, about the elaborate deception we've constructed. If she talks, there's no containing the damage." Margaret felt the walls closing in around them. Dr. Marsh represented not just a potential leak, but a ticking time bomb that could explode at any moment. A medical professional struggling with the ethical implications of her actions was perhaps the most dangerous kind of whistleblower imaginable. "We need to talk to Dr. Marsh," Alexander said urgently. "We need to understand what drove her to make that anonymous call and what it will take to ensure she doesn't make any more. She wants to bring Elena and the child back to England," Isabella said. "She believes that the separation is causing more harm than the potential scandal would. She thinks we're prioritizing the monarchy over the welfare of a mother and child." "She's not entirely wrong," Alexander said quietly. "Are we so committed to protecting the institution that we're willing to sacrifice the people it's supposed to serve?" The question struck at the heart of their dilemma. Margaret could see that Alexander was grappling not just with the practical challenges of implementing their deception, but with the moral implications of what they were doing. They were asking a mother to live separated from her child, asking a father to unknowingly raise another man's son, and asking an entire extended family to live with lies that could destroy them all. "Alexander," Isabella said gently, "sometimes there are no good choices. Sometimes we can only choose between different kinds of damage and try to minimize the harm to the greatest number of people. But at what cost, Mother? At what cost to our souls, to our integrity, to our ability to look at ourselves in the mirror each morning?" Margaret watched as the philosophical weight of their situation settled over the room like a shroud. They were discussing not just a political crisis, but a fundamental moral challenge that went to the core of who they were as human beings. The afternoon light was now fading into evening, and Margaret realized that they had been talking for hours without reaching any concrete decisions. The magnitude of what they were contemplating seemed to grow larger with each detail they discussed, each potential complication they identified. "Your Majesty," she said finally, "perhaps we should take a step back and ask ourselves a fundamental question. Is there any way to resolve this situation without creating more lies and more victims?" Isabella looked at her with an expression that mixed gratitude and despair. "Margaret, if you can think of such a way, I would be eternally grateful to hear it. Because I've been wrestling with this problem for months, and I can't see any path that doesn't require us to choose between different kinds of damage." As the weight of those words settled over the room, Margaret realized that they were about to discover whether their carefully constructed plan could save them all, or whether it would simply delay an inevitable reckoning that would ultimately prove even more devastating than the truth they were trying so desperately to hide. 3 weeks later, Margaret stood at the same window in Queen Isabella's study where this nightmare had begun, watching as a black sedan pulled through the palace gates. The car moved slowly, deliberately, carrying passengers whose arrival would either mark the beginning of healing or the start of an even greater catastrophe. After countless phone calls, careful negotiations, and sleepless nights of planning, Elena was finally coming home. The past weeks had been a whirlwind of carefully orchestrated deception. Captain Morrison had worked tirelessly with international law enforcement agencies to create the fiction of a kidnapping investigation that had successfully recovered Elena's son. Dr. Marsh, after hours of emotional conversations with Queen Isabella, had agreed to support the story, though her conscience continued to trouble her deeply. And Prince Damien had been told a version of the truth that painted him as the victim of his wife's betrayal, while protecting the even more explosive secret of his brother's identity as the child's father. Margaret remembered the conversation with Damien as one of the most difficult things she had ever witnessed. Isabella had chosen to tell him herself, sitting in the same study where the truth had been revealed to Alexander weeks earlier. Damien's reaction had been everything they had feared, and more: rage, betrayal, and a pain so deep it seemed to physically transform him before their eyes. But perhaps most surprising had been his acceptance of the situation. After the initial shock wore off, Damien had demonstrated a pragmatic understanding of what was at stake that had impressed even Alexander. He had agreed to participate in the fiction of Elena's affair with an unnamed foreign diplomat, to welcome back the child he now knew wasn't biologically his, and to work toward rebuilding their marriage despite the fundamental breach of trust that lay between them. He loves those children, Isabella had explained to Margaret after Damien left that day. Whatever else he feels about Elena, whatever anger or hurt he's carrying, he won't do anything that would harm Sophia, Marcus, or even the little one. They're innocent in all of this, and Damien understands that. Now, as Margaret watched the sedan approach the palace entrance, she wondered if that pragmatic acceptance would hold when Damien came face to face with the child who bore another man's features, when he had to embrace a son who would never truly be his own. The car came to a stop, and Margaret held her breath as the passenger door opened. Elena emerged first, looking fragile and uncertain despite the months she had spent preparing for this moment. She was thinner than Margaret remembered, her usually perfect posture showing signs of the stress and grief she had endured. Behind her, a nanny carefully lifted a small bundle from the car seat, the child whose very existence had set this entire crisis in motion. Margaret's heart caught in her throat as she got her first clear look at the boy. He was beautiful, with dark hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything around him with curiosity rather than fear. More troubling, however, was how much he resembled Alexander. Even from a distance, even as someone not looking for the resemblance, the family connection was unmistakable. "They're here," Isabella said quietly, joining Margaret at the window. The Queen's voice carried a mixture of relief and apprehension that perfectly captured the complexity of this moment. They had succeeded in bringing the family back together, but the real test would be whether they could all live with the fiction they had created. Alexander appeared in the courtyard moments later, having clearly been watching from another window. Margaret observed his body language as he approached the car, the careful control he maintained as he greeted Elena with the appropriate warmth of a brother-in-law welcoming home a sister-in-law who had been through trauma. But when his eyes fell on the child in the nanny's arms, his composure nearly cracked. Margaret could see the war of emotions playing out across Alexander's features: love, longing, grief, and a desperate desire to hold his son battling against the need to maintain the deception that would protect them all. The child, oblivious to the drama surrounding him, reached out toward Alexander with the innocent trust that only small children possess. "It's going to be harder than we thought," Isabella murmured, and Margaret knew she was referring to more than just the practical challenges of maintaining their story. How do you pretend not to love a child who is part of your very soul? Before Margaret could respond, Prince Damien appeared in the courtyard. She watched with fascination and dread as he approached his wife, and the child he now knew was not his biological son. His face was carefully neutral, but Margaret could see the tension in his shoulders, the deliberate nature of his movements as he forced himself to play the role of the reunited father. Elena's reaction to seeing her husband was heartbreaking to witness. She stood frozen for a moment, tears streaming down her face, before stepping toward him with obvious reluctance. When they embraced, it was with the careful distance of two people who had been intimate strangers for too long, who were now trying to navigate a relationship built on lies they both knew but could never acknowledge. "Papa," the child said clearly, reaching toward Damien with the same innocent trust he had shown Alexander. The word hit the courtyard like a physical blow, and Margaret watched as every adult present struggled to maintain their composure. Damien took the child from the nanny's arms, and Margaret was struck by the gentleness with which he held the boy who was, in every legal and social sense, his son. The reunion continued for several more minutes, with Sophia and Marcus appearing to embrace their baby brother with joy and relief that was both genuine and heartbreaking. They had no idea that the boy they were welcoming home bore no biological relationship to their father, that their family was built on a foundation of secrets that could destroy everything they believed about themselves. As the family group made their way into the palace, Margaret felt a complex mixture of emotions. They had succeeded in their immediate goal. Elena was reunited with her child, the family was back together, and the public story of a kidnapping and recovery was holding up under scrutiny. But the cost of this success was only beginning to become clear. "Your Majesty," Margaret said as they turned away from the window, "may I speak frankly?" Isabella nodded, settling into her chair with the weariness of someone who had aged years in the span of months. "What we've accomplished here, bringing that family back together, it's remarkable. But I'm concerned about the long-term sustainability of the deception we've created. That child is going to grow up surrounded by adults who know a fundamental truth about his identity that he himself can never know. The psychological implications of that are staggering." Isabella's expression grew thoughtful. "You're right to be concerned, Margaret. We've solved one problem by creating a dozen others. But what was our alternative? Allow Elena to deteriorate further in Scotland? Force Alexander to live with the knowledge that his son was growing up as a stranger on another continent? Let Damien continue to live with suspicions that would have eventually driven him to seek his own answers?" "I understand the reasoning," Margaret replied. "But that child is going to grow up in a house where his biological father can only love him from a distance, where his mother lives every day with the fear of discovery, and where the man he calls father knows he's raising another man's son. The emotional dynamics of that household are going to be incredibly complex and potentially damaging." Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the study door. Alexander entered without waiting for permission, his face flushed with emotion and his usually perfect composure nowhere to be found. "Mother," he said urgently, "we have a problem. Elena is falling apart." The reunion with the children was beautiful, but being back in the palace, having to pretend that everything is normal when she knows what she knows, she's on the edge of a complete breakdown. Isabella rose from her chair with alarm. "What exactly happened?" "She pulled me aside when Damien was getting the children settled," Alexander explained. "She said she can't do this, that she can't live every day looking at our son and pretending he's not ours. She said the guilt is eating her alive, and she's terrified that she's going to say or do something that will expose everything." Margaret felt her heart sink. They had been so focused on the logistics of bringing the family back together that they hadn't fully prepared for the emotional reality of living with such an enormous deception. "She's talking about leaving again," Alexander continued, "taking the boy and disappearing somewhere that she doesn't have to maintain the pretense. She says it would be easier for everyone if she just vanished." "That's not an option," Isabella said firmly. "Elena disappearing with the child now would raise questions we can't answer. The kidnapping story depends on the family being reunited and staying together. Then, we need to find a way to help her cope with the situation," Margaret suggested. "Perhaps Dr. Marsh could provide some psychological support, help her develop strategies for managing the stress of the deception." Alexander shook his head grimly. "Dr. Marsh is barely holding it together herself. Her guilt about falsifying the death certificate and participating in this elaborate deception is consuming her. She's been talking about confessing everything to the medical board." Margaret realized that their carefully constructed solution was beginning to unravel almost before it had been fully implemented. The human cost of their deception was proving to be higher than anyone had anticipated. "What about Prince Damien?" Isabella asked. "How is he handling the situation?" "That's perhaps the most surprising part of all this," Alexander said. "Damien is actually the strongest one among us. He's made peace with the situation in a way that I didn't think was possible. He's committed to raising the boy as his own son, to rebuilding his marriage with Elena, and to protecting the secret that could destroy us all. But at what cost to himself?" Margaret wondered aloud. How does a man live with knowing that his wife betrayed him with his own brother and bore another man's child? How does he love a child who will always be a reminder of that betrayal? Alexander's expression grew thoughtful. "I think Damien has found a way to separate the innocent child from the circumstances of his conception. He genuinely loves that little boy, regardless of genetics. The problem isn't with his relationship to the child. It's with his relationship to Elena and, frankly, to me. Isabella looked sharply at her eldest son. What do you mean? He knows, mother. Not officially, not in any way that he can act upon, but Damien knows that I'm the father of Elena's child. He's too intelligent and too observant not to have figured it out. The way he looks at me now, the careful distance he maintains, he knows. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. If Damien had deduced the truth about Alexander's role in the affair, then their carefully constructed fiction was even more fragile than they had realized. If he knows, Isabella said slowly, then why hasn't he said anything? Why is he continuing to participate in the deception? Because he understands what's at stake, Alexander replied. He understands that exposing the truth wouldn't just destroy us. It would destroy his other children, would bring down the monarchy, would create a constitutional crisis that could tear apart everything our family has built over generations. So he's choosing to sacrifice his own emotional well-being for the greater good, Margaret observed. That's either incredibly noble or incredibly tragic. It's both, Alexander said simply. Damien is making an impossible choice, because someone has to, and he's the one in the family with both the strength and the moral clarity to do it. They were interrupted again, this time by Captain Morrison, who entered the study with an expression of barely controlled panic. Your Majesty, he said urgently, we have a situation. I've just received word that a tabloid newspaper has been asking questions about Princess Elena's time in Scotland. They're also inquiring about the circumstances surrounding the youngest child's supposed death and recovery. Isabella's face went pale. What kind of questions? Specific questions, Morrison replied grimly. About the timeline of events, about inconsistencies in the medical records, about why the child was allegedly kidnapped, but no ransom was ever demanded publicly. Someone has been feeding them information. Margaret felt the floor drop out from beneath her feet. Their worst fear was materializing. Someone with inside knowledge was talking to the press. Do we know who? Alexander asked. Morrison hesitated before answering. We believe it's someone with access to palace medical records and security protocols. Someone who would have detailed knowledge of the events surrounding the child's birth and the subsequent arrangements. The implications hung in the air like a death sentence. There were only a handful of people with that level of access and knowledge. Dr. Marsh, Thomas the driver, the small staff who had been involved in coordinating Elena's time in Scotland, or someone within the immediate family itself. How long do we have before the story breaks? Isabella asked. Impossible to say, Morrison replied. It depends on how much information they already have and how quickly they can corroborate it. Could be days, could be weeks. Alexander began pacing the room, his mind clearly racing through their options. If the story is going to break anyway, maybe it's time to consider controlling the narrative ourselves. Get ahead of the scandal by releasing our own version of events. What version? Isabella asked. The truth about your affair with Elena? The fact that you're the father of her child? Alexander, there's no version of this story that doesn't destroy us. Margaret watched as the royal family faced the possibility that all their careful planning, all their elaborate deceptions, might prove worthless in the face of a determined press investigation. The irony was brutal. They had successfully brought the family back together, only to discover that the secret they were trying so hard to protect might be exposed anyway. Your Majesty, Margaret said quietly, perhaps it's time to ask ourselves whether the price of maintaining this deception has become higher than the cost of revealing the truth. Isabella looked at her with an expression of infinite sadness. You may be right, Margaret, but if we're going to fall, at least we'll fall knowing that we tried everything possible to protect the people we love. As the afternoon light faded once again through the windows of the study, Margaret realized that they were all about to discover whether love, sacrifice, and impossible choices could triumph over the forces that seemed determined to tear apart everything they held dear. The reunion they had fought so hard to achieve might prove to be not the end of their troubles, but only the beginning of an even greater test of their strength, their unity, and their ability to survive the consequences of secrets that had grown too large to contain.